Chapter 11. "How is your aim?" I whispered to Willie. "Why?" she whispered back, her voice shaky. Dennison wiped the back of his hand across his mouth, smearing saliva across his cheek. He grinned, a distorted stretch of thin lips. "Get on with it, man," Travers urged him. "I want to keep playing." "Throw the gun," I whispered to Willie. I thought she'd protest, but she wasted no time hurling her weapon at Dennison. He ducked, lost his balance and fell to his side. The gun clattered to the floor where it skidded under a table. Willie swore. Travers roared with laughter. "Stupid whore!" Dennison shouted. "You missed." He lurched to his feet. There wasn't a moment to lose. I reached behind me and snatched the carriage clock off the mantel. It felt solid, reassuring. The gold plating heated my skin and glowed in the candlelight. I threw it at Dennison's head. He saw it coming and ducked again, but the clock suddenly dropped too. It hit him square on the forehead. He fell back unconscious. "Bloody good arm," Travers said with admiration as he surveyed Dennison's prone form. "Run!" I shouted. Willie and I ran for the unattended door. Mr. Unger didn't try to stop us. Thankfully, no one did. Willie pulled open the door. I glanced back to see a collection of gentlemen gathered around Dennison, helping him to sit up. Blood trickled from his head wound, but he was alive, thank goodness. A bell clanged, and the porter at the base of the stairs opened the door there. Mr. Glass strolled through, holding a lantern. "Matt!" Willie cried. He lifted the lantern high. It illuminated the hard planes of his face and the black pools of his eyes. "Finally," he ground out. "I've been looking." "Yes, yes!" Willie rushed down the stairs and met him halfway. "Make yourself useful and fetch my revolver for me. It's up there under a table." Mr. Glass looked to me and then back to his cousin. His face darkened. "Why is your revolver not with you?" "There's no time to explain." She shoved him. "Go!" "No," I said as Mr. Glass climbed the stairs toward me. "Leave the gun." I glanced behind me, but the doorway was unattended. No one chased us. I tried to push past Mr. Glass, but he caught my arm. "What is going on?" His voice sounded strained, tight, and a little tired. "Matt'll be fine," Willie assured me. "No one will try anything with him, and if they do, he'll just throw a punch or two, won't you, Matt?" Mr. Glass went very still. He stood 2 steps below me, bringing our faces level. His chest rose and fell with his heavy breathing, and his gaze bored into mine, as if he could dig out answers. I swallowed and considered heading back into the gambling room. It could be safer. "Stay here," he growled. "I want an explanation upon my return." He let me go and pushed past me. He only got as far as the doorway, however, and Mr. Unger stood there with Willie's gun. He handed it to Mr. Glass. "Do not return, Miss Johnson," he said to Willie. "This establishment can't afford to attract unwanted attention." To me, he said, "You should have stayed home, miss. Places like this are not for gently bred women." He slammed the door in Mr. Glass's face. Matt whirled around. The lantern light swung in an arc, and the handle squeaked with the violent movement. "Get out, now, both of you." The porter held the door open for us. We hurried through the bootmaker's shop where the other porter let us out onto the street. Cyclops leaned against the carriage but straightened upon seeing us. "That was fast," he said. "We were on our way out when Mr. Glass arrived," I told him. Cyclops lowered the step and held the door open for me, but moved to the driver's seat when Mr. Glass ordered him to prepare to leave immediately. Willie followed me inside, and Mr. Glass came in behind her and suspended the lantern from the hook by the door. He thumped the ceiling and Cyclops drove off. He sat on the seat opposite Willie and me as the coach rolled away from the curb. "Explain." Willie humphed and held out her hand. "Give me my Colt." "Not until I get a satisfactory explanation." "You explain," Willie spat. "Why did you remove the bullets?" "To avoid you winding up on a murder charge. You left me unarmed. If you stayed in at night, you wouldn't need to be armed." She crossed her arms and turned away from him. "You should have told me about the bullets," she mumbled at the wall. Mr. Glass set his hat on the seat beside him and scrubbed his hand through his hair. "You're right. I shouldn't have left you vulnerable. But my opinion still stands. If you'd stayed away from the gambling houses, you wouldn't require a gun." He handed back the weapon. "And my bullets are at the house. I'll return them to you only if you promise not to gamble again." "Ever?" "Ever." "Matt, I can't. I have to win back my locket." His jaw fell open. "You lost your locket? Christ, Willie, I'm sorry." He closed his eyes briefly. "But I can't allow you to attempt to win it back. Promise me you won't gamble again." "Promise," she mumbled. He sighed and his expression softened. "Your opponent must have been formidable to have beaten you." Her lower lip wobbled. "He cheated." "I think he did too," I said. Mr. Glass pinched the bridge of his nose. "Now I know why you were attempting to use your Colt." "Oh, that's not why," I said. "Shh," Willie hissed at the same time that Mr. Glass growled. "Then why?" He glared at her. She looked out the window and sniffed. I rested a hand on her arm, but she shoved it off. "Leave me alone." I endured her silence and Mr. Glass's glare for the rest of the short journey to his house. Once inside, Duke greeted us with an equally formidable scowl. Willie tried to push past him, but he blocked her path. "Move," she snapped. "I'm in no mood for your lectures." "I don't care. You were supposed to be home hours ago. I've been out later than this before. Not with her, you haven't." Willie turned her thunderous look onto me. I hardly thought it fair to blame me when she'd invited me to go with her. I thought it wise to keep quiet on the matter, however. Her mood was black enough, and there was no telling if she had another stash of bullets for that gun. "Selfish, that's what you are," Duke went on. Willie's lips flattened, but Duke gave her no opportunity to cut in. "Yes, you are. You're a selfish woman, and it's time you were told. Matt does everything for you." "Enough, Duke," Mr. Glass chided. "Willie, go to bed. We'll talk in the morning." "See?" Duke waved a hand at Mr. Glass. "See what you've done?" Willie and I both turned to face him. He scowled at Duke, but in the better light of the overhead chandelier, I could now see the grey pall of his cheek, the dark smudges beneath his eyes. "You didn't rest, did you?" Willie said quietly. He didn't answer. She blinked rapidly and folded her arms across her body as if warding off a chill. "Did you at least use the—" He cut her off with a shake of his head and a glance at me. Her chin wobbled and her face crumpled. She threw herself at him and he caught her, staggering a little under her weight. "I'm sorry, Matt. I'm so sorry. I'll never take India to play poker again." I stamped a hand on my hip. "She wasn't even that good a distraction," she went on. "Is that why you invited me along?" I asked, as Mr. Glass held her at arm's length. "A good question," he growled. She wiped her nose on her sleeve. "I thought Lord Travers would find her interesting. Unfortunately, he was too engrossed in the game to pay her more than cursory attention." "You used me?" Willie merely shrugged. "I think I'll go to bed now. Matt, you must too. There's no point in staying up longer, understand?" Her gaze flicked to me, then back to him. Clearly, she didn't want me detailing the evening's events to him. He kissed her cheek. "Good night, Willie," he said on an exasperated sigh. "Why you been so nice to her?" Duke said once she'd gone. "After you rannin' and raving for the last hour, I thought you'd be sending her to her room for a week." "I have no authority to send her anywhere," Mr. Glass said. "She can do as she pleases. Besides, she's suffered enough tonight. She lost her locket." "Hell!" Duke tapped his head back and shook it at the ceiling. "She'll want to win it back." "I made her promise not to try." "You think that'll stop her?" "She's never broken a promise to me before." Duke sighed. "You have more faith in her than I do." "Therein lies your problem, Duke." Duke grunted. "I'll wager you had quite a dull night, Miss Steele. Willie's not good company when she's got the gambling fever." Dull is certainly not a word I would use to describe our evening. It was anything but. "Care to explain why Willie's colt was under the table?" Mr. Glass asked. "And why you were both fleeing when I met you?" "Fleeing?" Duke echoed. "I also heard a thud," Mr. Glass said. "That was the sound of Lord Denison falling to the floor," I said. Mr. Glass raised his brows. Duke gawped. "Why'd he hit the floor?" Duke asked. A clock hit him in the head. Mr. Glass and Duke exchanged mysterious glances. "How?" Mr. Glass pressed. "I threw it." "Why?" "He was paying me some unwanted attention. I suspect he was also drunk." "Bloody hell." Mr. Glass searched my face, his eyes sharper than they'd been since entering the house. "Miss Steele, tell me honestly, are you unharmed?" "I am." He blew out a measured breath, then shot a glare up the staircase in the direction Willie had gone. "Don't blame her," I said. "It's not her fault. The blame rests entirely on the shoulders of Lord Denison and his friend. They're not gentlemen at all. I've known vagrants with better manners." Mr. Glass bowed his head, but not before he closed his eyes. He really ought to be in bed, or using his special watch, perhaps both. "Let's return to the clock," Duke said with earnest. "So you threw it and it hit that fellow?" "Yes." "Did it feel odd to you?" "In what way?" "Did it sort of fly of its own accord?" "No," I laughed. "I threw it." "Did it feel warm to touch? Did it glow?" "That's enough, Duke," Mr. Glass said. "Miss Steele is tired and your questions are confusing her." "But—" Mr. Glass laid a hand on Duke's arm. They exchanged no words, but an understanding seemed to pass between them. Duke sighed. "Good night, Miss Steele." I watched him go, trying to fathom what he meant by his questions, and how he'd known the clock had felt warm. Was it special, like Mr. Glass's watch? If so, how and why? What metal had the watchmaker used? I'd never seen the likes of it. Mr. Glass seemed determined that I not be given any answers to my questions. That only made me more curious. They were all hiding a secret. If it didn't have anything to do with timepieces, I probably wouldn't have cared so much. But since a watch was involved, and now a clock, I wanted to know quite badly, but I would get nothing from him. "Do you require hot chocolate?" Mr. Glass's rich, melodic voice rumbled across the space between us. "No, thank you, I'm all right." His searching gaze studied every inch of my face. "Are you sure?" I nodded. Something Duke had said occurred to me. "Why were you ranting and raving earlier?" Several heartbeats passed before he responded. "Because you didn't return." But Willie says she's been out later than this and you've never worried so much. Willie dresses like a man and acts like a man. That keeps her safe. You, however, cannot hide your womanliness or your vulnerability. Is it so terrible that I was worried about you? My heart skipped to a mad tune in my chest. It was deeply satisfying to know he'd been concerned for my well-being, and yet it didn't quite make sense. We hardly knew one another. Perhaps he was presenting a facade again, but for what end I couldn't fathom. I began unbuttoning my coat, only to freeze when Mr. Glass slipped in behind me. His fingers brushed my neck above my collar and settled on my shoulders. He did not remove my coat, but bent his head to mine. "You haven't answered me," he murmured. What was the question again? "Cat got your tongue, Miss Steele." His breath fanned my hair at the nape of my neck. If I leaned back just a little, would he move away, or would he allow me to rest against his chest? "I can assure you I won't be gambling again," I said, my voice breathy. He drew the coat off my shoulders and down my arms, slowly. "Good." His voice vibrated through my body. "I'm glad to hear it." Why? I simply had to know or be eaten up with curiosity. If he was only pretending to flirt with me, I wanted to catch him out. I didn't want to be made a fool of again. "What does it matter to you?" He slipped the coat over my hands, but did not remove it entirely. I was trapped by my own clothing, yet I felt no panic and no vulnerability. This man wouldn't harm me. Why I felt so certain of that, I didn't know. While my head was telling me to run to my room, every other piece of me wanted to remain. "You're living under my roof for the time being," he murmured. "It's my duty to protect every member of this household, including you, Miss Steele." "It's not necessary." I hardly knew what I was saying anymore. My mind was filled with a fog that made it difficult to think beyond the present, heady moment. Does a landlord care what his lodger does in the evenings? "You're not my lodger." "Employee, then. Until Tuesday, that is." He drew in a sharp breath. Then he stepped away, taking my coat with him. He folded it over his arm, smoothing it with his hand. "Thank you for the reminder." "Reminder?" I shook my head. "Had you forgotten already?" He grunted a laugh, in a way. "Mr. Glass, are you feeling all right? May I get you something from the kitchen? Or perhaps you ought to go directly to bed. Pass me the coat, I'll hang it up." I was very aware that I was rambling, yet I couldn't stop. "You do look very tired." His jaw hardened. "Thank you for your concern, but I'm fine, and capable of hanging up the coat myself. Good night, Miss Steele." I sighed. I still wasn't sure if what had passed between us was real or not, but I missed it now it was gone. "Good night, Mr. Glass." "I ought to be doing something," I told Mr. Glass over breakfast when he declared that I wasn't required that day. "You're paying me to help you find Kronos. Sitting here while you go out is a waste of time. Surely there's something I can do." "I'm not looking for Kronos today," he said yet again as he buttered his toast. "And you can't search for him without me, only I know what he looks like." Cyclops and Duke busied themselves at the sideboard, piling toast, bacon and eggs onto their plates. But I got the distinct impression they were listening intently to our exchange. Neither Willie nor Miss Glass had ventured down from their rooms yet. I can ask after Mirth, I said. Someone may know where he's gone, who his friends are, etc. He bit off the corner of his toast and didn't answer me until he'd swallowed. It gave me time to study him. While he looked less tired, the shadow of illness still clung to him. He required more sleep. Someone may, he said, but they're unlikely to give the information to you. We've seen how the watchmakers of London react to you. I don't want a repeat of your encounter with Abercrombie. That encounter was still troubling me too, as was Mr. Glass's reaction to it. Whatever he'd said to Abercrombie the next day had appeared to put an end to the accusation. The police hadn't come looking for me. I wouldn't risk going to see Abercrombie, however, and asking him why he'd been so cruel. Not until I knew for certain that he wasn't going to call for the constables at the first sight of me. I think I'll visit the Masons, I said. Mr. Mason may know about the Mirth fellow. Very well. Enjoy your day out. Thank you. I sipped my tea. I thought the search for Kronos was vitally important. It is. Then why are you not spending today looking for him? You're running out of time. Damn good question, Duke growled as he sat beside me. Forget about the intruder, Matt. Your other business is more pressing. I beg to differ, Mr. Glass said. Cyclops, you tell him. Cyclops sat too. His pile of bacon toppled, sending the topmost piece onto the table. He stabbed it with a fork and stuffed it into his mouth, as if he'd been starved of bacon for years. After he swallowed, he dabbed his mouth delicately with a napkin. Matt is right, he said. We need to find the intruder. But you're also right, Cyclops went on. We need to find Kronos. Thank you for your insightful observation, Mr. Glass said wryly. Including today and not counting Tuesday as we leave in the morning, we have 3 days. The question is, can we find both men in that time? He picked up his teacup and swallowed the contents in one gulp. No, we cannot, Duke said. We've made almost no progress in the hunt for Kronos. That must be our priority. The other thing can wait until... His gaze flicked to me. Until after your watch is fixed. It can't wait, Mr. Glass growled. The intruder must be stopped before he returns. Why would he return here? I picked up the knife and leaned forward. You know him, don't you? He nodded. It's someone we've crossed paths with in America. Who? That's a private matter. I sliced the top off my boiled egg with a single strike of my knife. The force caused it to miss my plate and land on the table. Mr. Glass reached across the table, picked it up and placed it on my plate. He smiled. I scowled back. Mr. Glass, I said, who are you? I don't understand the question. Let me rephrase that. I picked up my spoon and dipped it into my egg, but did not eat. What do you do in America? What is your business? He sipped his tea slowly. Duke and Cyclops stopped eating to watch their friend. They seemed as curious to know how he'd answer as I was. Let's not discuss such vulgar things, as Aunt would put it, he finally said. I don't want to bore you, Miss Steele. I wouldn't find the opportunity to get to know you better boring, I said, hoping to bait him into telling me something. His lips parted. Then they kicked up on one side. If you insist on finding the intruder first and not the watchmaker, then so be it, Duke said quickly before Mr. Glass could speak. But I'd like it noted that I'm unhappy with the order of your priorities. Noted. Mr. Glass fetched the teapot from the sideboard. He refilled my empty cup. There was no more discussion of his business affairs or of the intruder. Of course, if he were an outlaw, he wouldn't tell me outright. Yet I was surprised he didn't lie either. "Miss Steele, may I ask you some questions about last night?" "Of course," I said, hoping he wouldn't ask for specifics about the attack on Lord Denison. I didn't want to relive the moments leading up to the clash. The thought of what could have happened made me feel even sicker today. I set aside my egg, no longer hungry, and placed my hand to my stomach. "Miss Steele, is everything—" "Mr. Glass, the tea!" He'd been refilling his teacup, but his gaze had been on me, not on his task. Tea spilled over the rim onto the saucer. He returned the teapot to the sideboard and picked up an empty cup. He tipped the spilled tea on the saucer into it and some of the excess from his own cup. "Your questions, Mr. Glass?" I prompted. "Yes, last night." He cleared his throat and sat. "The man who won Willie's locket, Lord Travers, what was he like?" "Portly, middle-aged. He liked cigars and he laughed a lot, but it had a somewhat arrogant edge to it. I also believe he cheated." "If he were in America, I'd call him out," Duke snarled. "If a mob didn't attack him first. We don't stand for cheats, Miss Steele." "We English don't either." Except Mr. Unger, the dealers and other gamblers hadn't challenged Lord Travers. Were they afraid of him? Was he too valuable to the house? Or was it a case of Britain versus America? Usually, anyway. "How was his accent?" Mr. Glass asked. I shrugged. "Plummy, as with all toffs. Why?" "Did the others seem to know him?" "Yes. Why, Mr. Glass?" "He played poker extremely well if he beat Willie, and he went from losing to her on previous nights to winning last night." "You think he's actually an experienced American poker player disguising himself as an Englishman in order to dupe people into betting against him? That's quite an accusation." "Aye," Cyclops muttered. "Perhaps he's a fast learner," Duke said. "Perhaps," Mr. Glass said, thoughtful. "But I think it's something to consider." I shook my head. "I disagree." "Do you now?" he drawled. "Yes," I said primly. "If he is an American pretending to be an Englishman for the sakes of fleecing unsuspecting gamblers, why would he choose to be a lord? It only draws more attention to himself when he'd want to avoid notice. Besides, it's likely he'd run into other lords at gambling houses, and surely they must all know each other, if only by name." "Good point," Cyclops said with a challenging lift of his one good eyebrow. "It would seem my theory doesn't hold water," Mr. Glass said on a sigh. "What theory is that?" I asked. "Why did you think Lord Travers might be American?" "That is my affair." "Oh, do you think the explanation would bore me?" I asked, throwing his words back in his face. "Or are you hiding something?" "We all have our secrets," he said quietly. "Even you." I met his dark gaze with what I hoped was a fierce one of my own. "Tell her," Cyclops said suddenly. "Tell her what you do, what you've done. I don't see no reason not to." Mr. Glass's gaze slid to his friend and darkened. His nostrils flared. "My business is mine alone. If I wish to keep it to myself, that is my affair. But don't, Cyclops." Mr. Glass's hand curled into a fist on the table. He held himself rigid as he continued to glare at his friend. Cyclops was the first to look away. "You're making a mistake." Mr. Glass got up and walked out. I waited, hoping Cyclops would go against his friend's wishes and tell me anyway, but he didn't. He and Duke finished their breakfast in silence. I gathered up a plate of eggs and bacon and took it to Miss Glass's rooms. I read the morning newspaper to her as she ate, then carried the tray and dishes downstairs afterward. I took the service stairs and met Miss Glass's maid, Polly Pickett, on her way up, a shawl over her arm. She stepped aside to allow me to pass and bobbed a curtsy. "May I take the tray for you, miss?" she asked. "No, thank you, and please, Polly, there's no need to curtsy every time you see me." Although I'd been introduced to her as Mr. Glass's employee, she'd treated me as a member of the household ever since. I suppose the rules in this household were unclear to her and to me, and she thought it safer to be submissive to all of us. She continued on her way up, and I continued on my way down. Mr. Glass's deep voice rumbled from the direction of the kitchen, but I couldn't quite make out the words. As I drew closer, I heard Cyclops' even deeper voice respond quite clearly. "Better for her that she doesn't know what you are, or better for you?" he asked. I stilled, hardly daring to breathe. It sounded like Cyclops was rebuking Mr. Glass for not answering my question about his business affairs over breakfast. I shouldn't eavesdrop. Bollocks, yes, I should. If I wanted to learn more about the people I was living with, I had to resort to underhanded methods. I inched closer. "It's not what I am," Mr. Glass said, "but what I've done. I don't want her to know." This last was added quietly. I distrained to hear him. Answering her question would have inevitably led to that. "Why don't you want her to know?" "Why do you think?" he snarled. "Aunt Letitia, too. Don't tell either of them." "It happened years ago. It's in the past, buried and forgotten. Then why does it follow me everywhere, even here and now?" Their silence was punctured only by the sound of liquid being poured. I was about to walk into the kitchen when Mr. Glass spoke again. "She's keeping a secret, too. The watchmakers are wary of her. She must know why." Now that I resented. I didn't have a clue why they shunned me. But it was time I found out.